What if living longer is the wrong goal? And focusing on the wrong things actually makes you age faster. In part one of our Longevity That Works series, we reframe longevity as capability, vitality, and enjoyability across your years. Today is part two of that series, where we get under the hood and look at how the body actually ages at a biological level. Because we cannot change what we do not understand. Our guest again is Dr. Bruce Feldman, founder of FeldMed, who works at the intersection of conventional medicine, advanced diagnostics, and personalized physiology. So, Dr. Bruce, good to have you back with us again. And I want to ask you sort of the starting question here, which is when you look at how the body actually ages, what is the earliest biological system you see that starts to drift in people and makes them feel, they start saying, I feel old?
So, hi, thanks for having me again. You know, I don't know the earliest biological system. I think that it's different for everybody. People start to notice things just aren't working right. So some people, their thinking is a little slower, let's say. They wake up achy. They're not rested like they used to be. Stuff is just moving slower, I guess.
Okay. I'll frame that out and dive in a little bit deeper. But before we do, I want to remind our audience that you are watching or listening to Well Wave Now, and that's where timeless wisdom lights your wellness path.
Yeah, when we look at aging, it doesn't happen all at once, right, Dr. Feldman? It's kind of a slow process, but it unfolds through systems that start to lose their flexibility and you start to lose your reserves. So, how does those core aging systems interact with one another when one system starts to shift or drift a little bit?
There are 12 categories in the what are called hallmarks of aging. And this is the technical structure that we think about sort of scientifically. How do we approach aging? And there are three main categories called primary, antagonistic, and integrative. And some of these things we all think about, for example, it's called deregulated nutrient sensing. What does that mean? You eat something, your body doesn't know what to do with it, right? Mitochondrial dysfunction, a very popular topic. Your mitochondria, the power plants in the cells, not doing what they're supposed to be doing. Cellular senescence, the cell is getting old. What does it do when it gets old? There's a thing called disabled macroautophagy. So when the cell gets old, you're supposed to take it out of circulation. You don't make proteins the way you used to. Your genetics are changing. The end caps, telomeres are getting broken down. As a consequence, the genes aren't doing what they used to do at the same level. Your gut microbiome screwed up. You've got chronic inflammation. The cellular communication doesn't work like it used to. And then lastly, you've got stem cells that don't do what they used to do. So that's a whole bunch of different stuff, all of which contributes to whether or not you're ending up where you want to be ending up, which is, I guess you could say, not getting older. So with that, each of those categories are very specific targets that we can use to figure out whether or not, what's going wrong, what's going right, where can we actually target so that we can make a difference.
Thanks. You went so you went through the systems there, and you got down to mitochondrial level. Look at that. If one of those are off, does it affect the others? How do they enter? Do the others start to compensate? Do the others? How does it affect the others?
So I like to say the hip bone's connected to the knee bone, right? So everything is connected always. In fact, one of the main drivers is often the failure of one system to talk to another system. So on the chart, we call that altered intracellular communication. So there are numerous types of communication signals, right? Everyone knows about hormones. That's the endocrine system, but there are nearly a dozen different systems responsible for getting everyone in the system to talk to each other and to be on the same page. So redox signaling, for example, deteriorates over time and is responsible for much of that intercellular information flow. The cell next to you needs to know what it's doing. Think about a flock of birds. They're all flying next to each other and they don't bang into each other. Well, how is that? Well, this guy's talking to this guy and this guy's talking to the next guy, and everybody sort of communicates effectively with the guy next to him. But the guy who's like way over there doesn't know what I'm doing until you make that progression. redox signal. So everybody's probably heard of redox of nitric oxide. That's a redox signal. It happens to be a nitrogen molecule and an oxygen molecule tied together, or rather a nitrogen atom, oxygen atom tied together into one molecule. And yet it's the main driver in blood pressure control, has an impact on immune function, learning, and memory. There are supplements that can support redox signaling, and by supplementing those signals, we can improve mitochondrial function. We can see effects on immune function, sort of direction of inflammatory responses, and overall enhance metabolic function. That's a target that really impacts all of those systems. So, if we want to go a little further, we can look at, for example, is a condition called syncope of the elderly, just to give you an idea of the connections, right? As older folks, some older folks pass out, right? Get up, they pass out. What happens? Well, when you stand up, the blood vessels of your legs have to constrict to increase blood pressure to keep up with that change in position. Heart rate increases in response. Often there's an increase in the squeeze of the heart itself. Sometimes the heart rate can't increase. Like if there's an arrhythmia, either it's too fast or too slow, you can't get enough blood to the brain. If you're on something like a beta blocker, for example, that reaction slows down. Now, when you tie all of these things together, each one may only be decremented, dropped down by a small percentage. Let's say 10% of this and 10% of that and 10% of this. By the time you add up a bunch of these processes, you're already at a 25% deficit. And if you don't have that reserve, that may not be enough to avert disaster.
Yeah. So, dumb this down for us, dumb it down for Dr. Bob. He's only a PhD. He's not an MD like you, Dr. Feldman. But, why can two people have the exact same diagnosis, but they're going to have a different recovery time?
So let's remember that the same diagnosis can be in a very different state, right? It's a diagnosis is just a general sort of aggregation of multiple mechanisms. So as such, the underlying processes that affect the resulting function are frequently very different. I like to say, everybody gets put in a box so that the box gets treated. That's all fine and dandy, except for the fact that, or except for when you want to get out of the box. If you got to get out of the box, you got to know how you got in the box in the first place. Okay. Now, genes, epigenetics, which we talked about before, all play a role in how these things develop, and then ultimately how we might intervene.
So the question to Dr. Bob, which is when we talk about these changes going on in people, and they're happening kind of like at an invisible level, what behavioral changes or psychological changes do you see in people starting to happen?
I think one of the biggest issues is people get scared because they become afraid really fast when the changes start coming on, and they do. I call it the uh-oh phenomenon. It's like, okay, here it comes, and then they start thinking about it, focused on it, and everybody in the growth and development world says whatever you focus on expands. If somebody's focused on how they're getting worse and worse in terms of their symptoms or their health status, it's gonna come that way. So that's part of the automatic programming that I talk about all the time, where people are automatically programmed to react a certain way, and they don't even realize that their reaction is detrimental to their futures. That's how I would answer that question from a PhD perspective.
One of the questions that often comes to mind is, why do people not sort of react before somebody turns the fan on, if you catch my drift? The reality is that the human condition is one of redundancy and resilience. So as such, we get away with a lot, right? So
yeah, we can put up with a
don't
lot.
have to pay attention because they can ignore it.
Well, they're also, it's like a fish swimming in water. It's like that's the life that they're living, and they don't even know what's going on until they pop out of the water. The fish pops out and it says, "Oh, this pops back in the water. This is what water is." So people are living their lives.
There's no question I have experience with people where I say, look, you actually have no idea how good you could be.
Yeah, they think they can't.
So pick that line of thought, Dr. Bruce, a little further. So how about sharing a case where you've identified and sharing, you don't know how good you can be, and there's a couple of different drivers on that, and you were able to tweak it. How to shift their energy, how to shift their recovery, how to shift their life?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a single thing like that, but I'll say, for example, my number one driver that I think needs to be addressed first is sleep. On some level, sleep apnea is the worst. It makes everything worse. Blood pressure, insulin resistance, adrenal function, cognitive function. Sometimes it's quite obvious when you've treated somebody effectively, they come back, the whole world is like a new place, right? All of those metrics end up being better, and obviously the people feel better when you get better sleep, but their blood pressure and their blood sugar and their cholesterol, all that stuff improves. But, I'll make the point that it's not just the guys with the big heavy necks, right? There are thin women who may be snoring, who have significant upper respiratory related sleep apnea. And if those aren't treated, they're going to have the same problem.
Well, I agree with you, Dr. Bruce. Sleep is vital. I mean, it's a number one. So, and the problem is when people are stressed out, it's hard for them to sleep well anyway. And then you got all the stress effects on the body and
It's definitely a
causes,
point of focus. I mean, it requires attention for sure.
yeah,
We want
definitely.
to come. We want to come back to sleep. We'll maybe talk a little about stress a little bit in the next segment here. But I think Breck's got a word for us at this point.
Yeah, yeah. In our next segment, we want to get into those why those systems kind of drift out of balance. But before that, let's hear about Brain IQ, the pain eraser roll-on. It's used by our very own Tim Daniels. After years of knee damage as a D1 athlete and an avid exerciser, he gets relief from Brain IQ pain eraser. Delivers instant targeted relief using advanced nanotechnology combined with real powerful natural ingredients that absorb quickly right where you need them. No pills, no mess, just roll it on and get back to moving. It's ideal for your lower back pain, your knee pain like Tim, shoulder pain, joint discomfort, or just everyday aches and pains. Makes it a great option for active adults and busy professionals and anyone that's just tired of being slowed down because of pain. We'll make a link available to you in the show notes here so you can check out Brain IQ Pain Eraser Roll-On.
Yep. Yep. So, I mentioned I using it, and certainly it doesn't get at the root cause like Dr. Bruce does, but what it does do is give that temporary relief to allow me to keep functioning, keep moving, keep improving, and do some things that do help get at the root cause of things. So my knees are starting to get as good as Dr. Bob's now. And Dr. Bruce, we mentioned, you'd mentioned the things, the interaction between the systems and how they function. You also talked about the redundancy in there. And that gets to me that it also tells me, the systems are meant to adapt. With that redundancy, with that adaptation, and you talk about sleep, let's say with sleep and stress, what really starts causes things to get, out of whack here a little bit? And why do they, lose that flexibility over that time and redundancy? So I kind of see that as key to being able to say, how do we start addressing it? Is kind of understand why they drift over time.
So, to me, stress drives everything. I mean, every input is a stress, whether it's a eustress, as they like to call it, or a distress. Everything's a stress. Everything you do, the body is responding. There's an input. That input is a stressor on the system, and it requires a response. So I fall back on genetics. Many people have issues with how their systems respond to different stresses. And that's why I do the genetics, because you have an ability to understand what may be presenting itself as a greater challenge in one person than to another. And then those can be attended to make efforts to keep things working optimally and to change certain foundational elements.
Yeah, so when you look at that stress load, if it's at a really chronically high load, how does that show up biologically? Mitochondrial output, inflammation signaling, nervous system tone.
So, I mean, like all of those things are important, but I mean, the easiest way to think about it, it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but stress is high, cortisol is high, right? It's fight or flight. So, what happens when that happens? Well, the first thing that happens really is the sugar goes up. So, that drives insulin resistance, which causes visceral fat deposition. So, you get fat around the belly, is an inflammatory organ in its own right. So as a consequence, I mean, insulin resistance leads to microvascular disease. So all the little tiny blood vessels at the end where all the business happens start getting damaged. Small blood vessels get damaged. That's a big deal. there's a whole new, there's another relatively newly discovered, it's 10 years old at least anyway, notion about blood vessel feature called the glycocalyx. So the glycocalyx, it means sugar tree. And what I'd like people to think about is to draw a picture in their head of an ocean kelp forest, right? And if you've ever watched National Geographic and you see these underwater things, you got all these big leafy kelp and there's fish swimming around and all kinds of stuff, right? The denser the forest, the richer the ecosystem, the healthier things are. Well, and as the ecosystem suffers, it starts to thin out. The analogy at the blood vessel wall is very, very good. Okay. The thicker, the denser that is, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why it's true that that is the case. And I could talk about that at some other point. But the reality is that the thicker, the more dense that ecosystem, the better the blood flow, the more efficient it is, the better delivery of that flow to the tiniest blood vessels all the way at the end, which again, that's where everything works. And if you can't get the blood to the very end, all that stuff dies. And that's where you start degrading. So everything's about that. Now, it turns out that insulin resistance has been shown to deplete that glycocalyx by at least 50%, right? If people remember, for example, when COVID hit and people were in the intensive care unit, if they were on a ventilator, their glycocalyx was shown to have lost 95% of their forest, right? And then nothing works.
So how do you, I don't know, we weren't necessarily going to start fixing things until segment 3 of this, but right now that just kind of begs the question, as you talked about earlier in the redox and the signaling, there were things that can be done. So how do you protect this forest? How do you replenish the forest?
Well, so turns out the glycocalyx is an extraordinarily dynamic system. And within, potentially days, with the right supplementation, you can actually improve that density.
What happens there? What happens with the right supplementation? What's going on?
You're essentially regrowing that little furry surface. So, I mean, the short story version, and, you get pretty far afield on some of this stuff, but, it starts with the heart is not a pump, right? The heart generates an electrical field with blood flowing in a vortex pattern that generates a central negative ion column. And that negative flow is met most efficiently by a vessel that also has a negative charge. So the negative is flowing through the negative and there's no resistance. Well, the glycocalyx is critical to the establishment of that negative charge at the cell surface. And if it's not thick enough, you don't have a good enough negative charge, the blood will stop flowing before it gets to the very end. So if we nourish that appropriately with the appropriate supplements and the like, you can make a big difference in how well that blood flows, actually. So people who have, for example, just as an example, diabetic foot ulcer, or a diabetic skin ulcer that doesn't want to heal because the blood doesn't get to the end where it needs to, right? If you supplement specifically for enhanced glycocalyx recovery, you can see that ulcer disappear over a relatively short period of time. Realize that some people have these things for years, and you can get this thing fixed in a period of multiple weeks.
So we may have people, I don't know how many people we've got listening on, viewing us on Facebook or TikTok. They're probably sitting there like in the movie sometime, or come on, get to the punchline. Come on, give me that. So you've been talking about this right supplementation. And again, we want to say something for part 3, but I feel we owe our audience something. We got to hire you, Dr. Bruce, to come a patient for you to tell us what that right supplementation is. What's the right supplementation, Dr. Bruce?
Well, I mean, so here's the problem that I have, right? As a professional, my 2 favorite words are depends.
I was trained as an economist a long time ago, and that was the economist's two favorite words too.
If you're talking to a professional, and every case looks different, right? There are subtleties. there are important pieces that need to be taken into account. And just giving a generic answer to this stuff, yeah, if you take A, B, C, D, E, F, G, you're going to get improvements most of the time. But if, for example, let's say you have a genetic predisposition where you don't methylate your folate, right? You have what's called MTHFR problem, right? If I give you too many B vitamins, you're going to have a real problem. All of this requires some thought, right? I can give you the Glycocalyx rebuilder, right? And likely it's not going to generate any problem. But then again, how do you even know that that's your problem?
Right.
Now, I will, in full disclosure, I take one of those things because I think it's good and I know it's not going to get me into any trouble. But am I wasting money? I can't tell you the answer to that. Not really, right? I'm doing it preventively because I think that the risks are low and the potential benefits are high, and so it becomes a financial decision as much as anything else. But who wants to take, handfuls of supplements? I'm not Brian Johnson, for God's sakes. I don't want to spend that kind of money and I don't want to eat that kind of pills.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
also belief, we were talking, Tim and Breck and I were talking earlier, belief has something to do with this. Right, Tim, you want to say anything about that?
well, not necessarily in this case. I don't want to say anything about that in this case. I'm going to hold. That's for another. As Dr. Bruce said, it depends. It depends on the situation, Dr.
Right,
Bob.
yeah.
So
I
I won't
gotcha.
bring belief into this at this particular point.
All I'll say is belief plus supplementation is better than supplement alone. That's what I'll say.
Yes. Yeah.
But
So-
yes, 100%,
Yeah.
100%, you know.
uh,
I think that there are lots of things that we can do that are relatively simple, right? I mean, to be honest, the four fundamentals as I see them, and I think we talked about this before, right? First is sleep, second is exercise, third is diet, and fourth is social connection. If you can take care of those four things, a lot of this other stuff becomes not that important. Now, having said that, if your genetics are kind of screwed up, you're going to have to make some allowances. So that's where the genetics comes in, because you want to make sure that you've got your I's dotted and your T's crossed. I mean, everything is about perspective, right? If all you want to do is be able to climb, one flight of stairs without stopping, you probably don't need to be on the bike for 3 hours a day. Just saying.
Sure. Yeah. No doubt.
But you might need to be on that bike 3 hours a day to release some stress, getting back to our stress and sleep thing a little bit here. I took us off the path. That's just because I wanted to give people some answers, and Dr. Bruce kind of gave a little bit of an answer
It
there.
depends, Tim. It just
Yeah.
depends.
Basically told me I have to call him and make an appointment now so he can look at
I
me
mean,
genetically.
I will, we can link. There's a redox signaling supplement that we can link in the show notes or whatever that, is extraordinarily safe. But what's the problem with it? Well, the problem with it is that it works. Okay. And if you have stuff like real something going on, it's going to mobilize all of that junk. And if you don't do it judiciously, right? If people have ever done detoxes on their own and they feel like crap, there's a reason for that, because you didn't do it right, right? So all of these things can be done DIY. But you know what? When you DIY'd your garage, how did it turn out? I mean,
It
there's a
depends. It
reason there
depends.
are professionals to do some of this stuff. And,
So now we look at this stuff and say, doing it right. Looking back on the dysfunction, dysregulation starting to happen a little bit in people. Do you think, is it a case that sometimes is it always a big stress that cause it to fall apart? Is it the little stressors continually? Is it a combination of both?
yeah.
What do people have to manage?
Yeah, well, so anthropologically, we're designed for intermittent stress, right? You get chased by the lion, you escape the lion, you rest, you hide until you can go out and do it all over again, right? Same kind of, fasting kind of deal. You'd get plenty of food for a little while, then you'd go for long periods without eating. Those are all stresses that are intermittent. There's feast or famine, as they say. one big stress. And if you have time, you can recover. Keep getting hit, no meaningful recovery time. I mean, I say this all the time. There's no such thing as overtraining. It's merely under recovery. You can beat yourself up pretty seriously over a short period of time. As long as you have time to recover, you'll be all right. But chronic stress doesn't allow that, right? The cell phone, the 24-hour news cycle, whatever it is, all of these things are pounding us constantly. So to me, it's all about recovery, whether that's sleep, just getting some calm and quiet time, or even simply connecting with like other people you like. That acts as recovery, right? You need
And
that.
that's why you connect with us so much, because you like
That's
us so
why
much.
yeah. And fortunately, I only need to do this once a month, but otherwise, no.
It's like the trainer, telling the boxer to work the body. That first punch may have stung a little bit, but it didn't really affect the opponent until you do it multiple times over and over again. Now it starts to break down. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Rope-a-dope.
exactly. Exactly. Now, Dr. Bob, you always talk about it, interrupting stress, right? That's one of your core principles. So the perception of stress, how is that influencing, your biological drivers over time?
It's always like the chicken or the egg, it's like the genetic makeup and the really dictating how people respond, and then they get stressed, or is it a stress reaction that happens to some circumstance that leads the genes to come into play the way they would come into play. So I mean, I always look at it like I don't really go for the gene argument for much of anything, even though it's probably very, very important. But I just think that if we blame something on genetics, we have no power to do anything about it. So I always look for what changes can we make? And so I have methodology that I use with people to help them recognize their stressors and then interrupt those really fast so that they're not at the effect of those stresses. And and that's what Dr. Bruce is talking about, leading to good sleep. You got to get some kind of stress mediation before you can get good sleep. If you don't, you're not going to get good sleep, and life is going to be bad and health is going to be deteriorating. So, as Dr. Bruce said, the stress is like number one, and you got to go after it. And I just go after it a little bit different way, and I don't really pay attention too much to, how much is the genetic background impacting somebody's responding to circumstances in the moment. To me, I've never worked with anybody that couldn't at least interrupt the responses when I was working with them, and hopefully they can carry that on in their lives afterwards. It's all about
I mean,
interrupting.
that's, I want to be clear that the genetics don't affect, what you're talking about. If, for example, there are enzymes that break down neurotransmitters that may be fast or slower than normal, right? Well, someone's got a behavior where they're sort of cycling in and out of moods very quickly. And then you see their genetics say, hey, you process these things really fast. If I can give you certain supplements to slow that process or enhance the presence of that, so there's more stability in those neurotransmitters, that's where the advantage is. It doesn't help you this second you're in crisis right now. No, all of what you're saying is 100% correct, but we can make things maybe a little bit easier, right?
Yeah,
That's the point.
But
absolutely.
and then if I go back to discussion from part one, and then in general, your thought, Dr. Bruce, is also more on that. Yes, you want to take into account the genetics, but it's more the epigenetics, what causes those things to manifest themselves. And so that's when you talk about, so both Bob's interruption and your approach and other things kind of shuts off the manifestation of those genetics.
Right. Exactly. I mean, the genetics is going to determine sort of the rate at which things will default to. And then the epigenetics are all of the inputs that sort of adjust or modulate those kinds of responses.
Can you just explain epigenetics in one sentence for everybody?
So genetics are the DNA. That's what you're born with. That doesn't change. It defines what is possible, so to speak. The epigenetics is turning on the switches in combinations so that the end output is ultimately determined. But you can turn switches off and on through every single thing you do or don't do, everything you think, everything you do, all the environments you're in, people you interact with, all shift those switches.
Yeah. Thank you. Good explanation.
Well, now people may not notice when they're seeing or having those shifts biologically change just in small shifts, but they do notice when their reserves are depleted or gone, right? And so, what does the reserve capacity mean when you're talking about muscle, organs, brain function?
So I think the easiest metric to talk about, it's getting a lot of play recently in the longevity space anyway, is VO2 max, right? Now, I just read something sort of contradicting VO2 max as the end all be all, but it's a surrogate and we'll make it just leave the technical facts aside for now. What is VO2 max? It's basically how much oxygen can you absorb and utilize every minute? What's the max that you can do? You have to be able to pull in enough oxygen. It's got to get into your system. You got to be able to utilize it. And that's sort of what determines how well you can go. It declines with age, but that decline can be slowed. So you probably heard about zone 2 training. That's where you get your heart rate up to an area where you're working hard, but you can still sort of talk. Full sentences are a little tough. But that will help delay that degradation, that slowing down, right? Now, it's easy to think about not being able to hike a mountain because you get short of breath, right? Shortness of breath tells you you're approaching your maximum. When you're younger, the maximum is higher. But part of that is your maximum heart rate is also age related. So that starts to decline, and that also contributes to your VO2 max. So think about your heart rate can only go up to 90% what it used to. And assuming the squeeze on the heart is more or less the same, you've now lost 10% of your output, right? Now, blood flow defines all of those possible functions, right? If your we talked about the glycocalyx, right? You've got to, even if you're pumping, let's say you can pump, but you can't get it all the way to the end, that degrades things. So all these things start to decline and they all interact. But if you pay attention to all of these individual components, you can make little inroads and you can build it back and slow that decline.
So you slow the decline. So I guess, at some point, Breck and Bob have heard me mention this in multiple times. You might have to too. Where I say, my belief it's 120 years is what you got. So it's at the maximum. And so at some point you may have to climb. Although I got my Moses plan. I told you guys about the Moses plan. The Moses plan really is you ought to be able to climb that mountain at 120 and just say, that's it, it's time to go. But, but let's assume that not everybody completely makes the Moses plan. You want me to get into belief earlier? I'm not going to do that directly, Bob. Indirectly, Harry. Yeah, there's Caleb also. Caleb at 85, and it was so that I can still go out, or I can still go out, and I can still come in, and I can still lead people into battle and bring them back in on that. But at some point, let's say it's got to decline a little bit. How can you determine or help people determine, Dr. Bruce, if they're declining faster than they should be? What are a couple of signals in there? What are a couple of indications? This may get back to your decathlon that one of the
I was going to say, yeah, we talked about this before. It's all about redundancy and resilience, right? And attitude, right? People who are focused on getting stuff done will ignore the signals until they can't ignore them anymore. That's a problem, right? They don't really feel fine. They just don't pay, they just don't think it's bad enough to pay attention to.
It's really okay.
Yeah, it's like, I'm fine. I'm fine. Yeah. Well, no, you're not fine. Yeah, you get away with what you're doing. That's different than being fine.
Yeah.
So a lot of it has to do with, how much are you paying attention to, right? Think about when was the last time you felt as good as you ever have? It's a really good question, right?
People's memory can't go back that far.
Yeah, well, that's probably a pretty good signal that there's some opportunity.
Yeah, sure. I got one other thing I'd like to put in.
And my tagline is limitless healing because you can always do a little better.
Yeah, and I'm with you on that. I love that line, limitless healing is beautiful. One thing I wanted to ask you, Dr. Bruce, because I see with people that I see a lot of people where there's a balance between what's going on with their physical structure and what's going on with their internal organ health. You know what I mean? Some people's physical structures are beat up to, like mine, beat up to the max from all the injuries that I've had in my life, and internal organs can be in a completely healthful state. And so, how does that feed into longevity? Somebody's got a great body structure, but their internal organs are screwed up. I mean, what does it take to get those in balance and get them optimized in 30 seconds? I mean, it's a hard question, but
Well, I mean, so you're talking about orthopedic stuff. So, that could be connective tissue, that could be bones and joints. There's a lot of things that you can do. There's a whole science around fascia, which has been virtually ignored by the allopathic medical profession, right? So, fascia is the only organ in your body that extends from the top of your head to the tip of your toe and connects everything. And, in medical school, it was really just sort of, yeah, it's there. Meanwhile,
yeah,
there are like a whole sensory systems there. I mean, if you think about the biology of what it takes to hit a fastball from a major league pitcher, if you just implicate the standard nervous system, the signal from the eye to the brain to the hands to move to make a swing and contact the ball, you don't have enough time. The signals take longer to be able to do all of that stuff so that it's impossible, according to standard medical theory, to be able to hit a baseball. Well, there are plenty of people who hit a baseball. So what is that about? Well, there's another piece of the puzzle that is being largely ignored by the conventional medical space, and it has profound impacts on all sorts of levels of function.
However, I
Sorry,
will
that was a
mention
little aside, but that's another one of these
no,
pet peeves
and
I
I
have.
like that aside, but that same analogy, somebody that can only hit the ball every other time is a tremendous average, right?
Yeah, right.
500%, but that's still missing it 50% of the time too.
Yeah, well, in medical school, in the first week in medical school, they tell you, listen, you're going to study a lot of stuff, and you should know now that half of what we tell you is wrong.
wow,
And
that's
the
pretty generous.
and the problem is that we can't tell you which half.
Yeah. Wow.
Well said, man. Do they really? Do they really teach that in medical school?
Yeah, more or less. I mean, yeah, because I mean, if you're being responsible, you have to recognize that, you're doing science. Science is not exact, right? There is
Not
no
at all.
exact science, especially when it comes to the human body. I mean, the number of biological signals that have been elaborated since I was in medical school, there are whole pieces of health that didn't even exist.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
I
You
mean,
were
we were
talking
doing
about
we still only know this much.
I mean, we didn't use leeches when I was in medical school. Now we're back to using leeches in certain cases. So, I mean, what the hell?
They use leeches, but Dr. Bob studied with some doctors for a while.
yeah,
They used leeches back in those days too. That's how far Dr.
I look pretty good for 140 years old. I'm
yeah.
sorry, Jim, 120.
It's probably the leeches.
I'm glad that you defined, the physical or the what your orthopedics are resolving versus, what we were talking about before. Because when you were talking about supplements being able to increase, blood supply, that's not going to work in certain things like osteochondritis, right? The blood leaving the bone. There's got to be some other intervention. So I know this because my son had to go through that. We moved from a soft field in the South where, you actually had some moisture in the ground to Arizona where it's just rock hard. And that running, pounding and pounding and pounding literally started to kill his femur, and the blood supply wasn't able to get to the end, and then your cartilage starts to flake off. I don't think a supplement would repair that, right, Dr. Feldman? That actually required some surgical intervention to go in there and bring that blood
Well,
supply back.
again, it depends. I'm not sure, we don't have enough information to really clarify that, but there was a recent product that came on the market, really phenomenal kind of results that actually shows that we can regrow cartilage with a supplement. And then so think about degradation in like an osteoarthritis situation, right? Old knees, I need a knee replacement or a hip replacement or whatever. It turns out that you could take that supplement, and because it's working, if you understand the degradation process, it's an inflammatory process. So if you can stop that inflammation and then allow for regrowth, that decline in inflammation actually translates to systemic decline in inflammation, which translates directly to decreased cardiovascular events. So you're fixing your knees, you're fixing your hips, and you're helping your heart. That's
Yeah, man,
crazy.
overall health.
What'd you say, Dr. Bob?
Your overall health is going to improve for sure. What I find, Dr. Bruce, is that uh, joint degradation is a combination of inflammation and excess muscle contraction, compressing the joint, putting abnormal forces on the joints. In my mind, I have to take care of both. I have to decrease the inflammation component. And I have to teach people how to release the muscles around the joint so the joint space can be there the way it should be there, and not excessively compressed, wearing out.
So, by the way, I wrote a blog recently. It's titled "It Must Be the Shoes." If you guys remember the Nike commercial, there's a company called Apos Therapy that makes a micro instability sneaker that is developed and utilized through a computerized gait analysis. So you walk across a computerized filmed walkway. It integrates all this information on stride length and weight transfer and all this sort of stuff. And then it designs sneakers that have these little balls on the bottom that create instability as you're walking. The signal is interrupted. What you're talking about, Dr. Bob, is the splinting activity across a joint when there's pain. You have inflammation. The natural response is to contract the muscles across the joint to keep it stable. If you're still walking on it, well, that's not helping you. Well, when you interrupt the nerve signal back and forth, you no longer splint adequately. So that instability causes relief almost immediately. So wearing these sneakers an hour a day, and you can delay knee replacement by 2 years or more.
Wow.
Yeah, interesting. The thing is, though, there's a lot more going on. If you can really delay the knee replacement by 2 years, for instance. That's like saying that's like in cancer. We call it success in cancer if we can extend life 3 or 6 months when somebody's 80 or 90 years old. You know what I'm saying? It's a small amount of time. How can we completely resolve something so that
Well, so you add the supplement in with these sneakers, and God only knows, and of course, the study went out 2 years. I don't know what we're talking about ex-NFL and NBA guys who pretty messed up, who are still waiting on their joint replacements.
Yeah. It gets back to your multimodal, Dr. Bob. So you take a look at that, and your point, other part, the PEMF can work at the bone level. That's what was first
I
approved
think
for
you,
back
I
in
think you need it all, Tim, like you're saying. I think you need it all. You got to go
Yeah,
after it.
let me finish. Let me finish, Dr. Bob.
Okay.
So it's a multimodal. It's like that. The PEMF can work at that bone level. That's what was supposed to prove that back in late '70s. And so it's definitely getting blood flow back at that bone level in there. You got so I have noticed a change in supplementation. But I will also say, I rarely use the NSAIDs with my knee, but I went up when I go to visit my son. Sometimes I do because he's got a lot of stairs to go up and down. So I think I told you this, Dr. Bob. So the last time I did that, though, I forgot all my learnings, which saying, that's not really addressing anything at the root cause, is masking. But it felt so good. I was just really going up and down the stairs, and I was really working on things. I tell you, as soon as I came off those NSAIDs, I had the worst pain literally in every step that I had had in ages. So I tried a number of things, but it gets back to the point, and it gets back to Dr. Bruce's point earlier, if I get it. In this whole process, I didn't realize how much I had been losing in general until I started coming back from this. And part of what helped me realize that is I said I tried acupuncture. I was using to see if my supplements are one of the ones you talked about. I use UC2, UC2 in there. I use ester C. I use collagen peptides. Use hyaluronic acid. All working on this thing. It was getting back in collagen peptides 1, 2, and 3. I started walking in the pool and walking forward, walking backward, doing like the basketball side to side through there, doing lunges in the pool. And I tell you, finally, I got that pain down. So it wasn't a pain in every step. But I also noticed now was now getting better lateral movement than I was getting before on that because of, all the various things that go on in the knee that Dr. Bruce could tell us about. But I will say now it's better than has been in years. And I hadn't even really realized the slippage before until I had that one pain kick up in there. But
I think
and but
I
that's
think
also the state that, to Dr. Bruce's point, even when things seem too far gone, you can get improvement
Yeah.
without
I
that
think there are a
surgery.
couple things. I mean, there's first off, I'll just say the PEMF is a really interesting opportunity for really for everybody. There's no question it improves microvascular nutrient delivery. I don't know of any study that has tied the health of the glycocalyx to use of PEMF, but I would be surprised if there wasn't an interrelationship there. It's felt that, or at least the reporting from most of the PEMF people is much more around sort of the stickiness of the blood vessel, or the decreased stickiness of the blood, and that's what facilitates the flow. I think it's more than that. If
Yeah.
the photos or the videos that I've seen that document that kind of flow is not at a high enough resolution to be able to demonstrate the glycocalyx in that regard. So that's a missing piece, right? The other thing I was going to say is that back to the fascia, a lot of what you're doing, and I think this is a Dr. Bob's point as well, is you're generating much more flexibility slash mobility. And when you're able to do that, a lot of the intrinsic points of contact, balance, movement, all of those sort of integrated pieces now just work better. When we get locked up, and acupuncture, by the way, also improves some of that information flow. That's the thing. Again, we come back to the redox. A lot of this has to do with information flow within the system. When the information is not getting from point A to point B effectively, point B doesn't know what point A wants to do. They don't work together. It's a mess.
Integration, right? Integration.
Well,
That's why
Dr.
I love.
Feldman, you've addressed all the questions I had for this segment. I have a whole list of questions for segment 3, and looking forward to having you back on that, of course. But any other questions from Dr. Bob or Tim?
I thought that was really great, Dr. Bruce. I mean, you brought up some great points, and I love the fact you're talking about fascia. Almost nobody talks about fascia,
I
and it's
know.
so
I know.
important. It's really
Yeah.
important.
Before we run away, I think you should put up that face picture.
Yeah. And as I do that, we talked about fascia, but we didn't really explain what fascia was. So as I get the picture, you might want to talk it out a little bit, Doctor.
So if anybody's ever cleaned a chicken, there's stuff in between the muscles and it's kind of slimy or it's goopy or whatever. I mean, it's the stuff that isn't the stuff you eat largely. It's just the connective stuff, but it's in there that a lot of information gets transferred.
Yeah, I mean, there's sheets and there folds, and I mean, it's everywhere. It's just incredible.
It literally is everywhere. You can remove all of the other parts of the body and leave the fascia, and you will see what looks to be an entire human body.
And what's the overall purpose of it?
Well, it kind of holds everything together on some level. But fundamentally, there are, so for example, your cell phone has an accelerometer in it. Well, your fascia has accelerometers, right? It allows you to know where pieces, body pieces are in space. It's the pressure sensing. It's some of the other, there are other general senses that work through the fascia. So what you see is the same person, sort of AI generated, with 10 years on either side of, your presumed biological age. So the gal and the girl in the middle are, their biological age is the same as their chronological age. But if you look at the people who are 10 years younger by biological age or 10 years older than their chronological age, they appear very different. And we all know people like this, right? We know people who look a lot younger than they are, or they look a lot older than they are. This ties directly, the face ties directly to, like, basically how old are you biologically. So it gives you some hints. Now, if you've been somebody who's been out in the sun all, their whole life and everything else, maybe you look a little more weather worn, but the hairline, I mean, for example, the hairline or the thickness of the hair is not just about testosterone levels. It can also be about microvascular supply. Diabetics lose hair on their lower legs, their feet, long before anything else, because they can't supply the blood to the tiny blood vessels for the hair follicles. I mean, we have ways of sort of, kind of triaging, so to speak. But I mean, there's a lot of opportunity. I'll just leave it at that. There's a lot of opportunity, and it isn't just in your conventional medical office. That's for sure. You're
Yeah,
missing
that's
a
for
lot of stuff there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's really
Any other message you have for us, Dr. Bruce, today to kind of wrap this up? What do you think you've taught us today, Dr. Bruce?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I would emphasize is that we have lots of opportunity. I think that, there are opportunities in sort of every area that we can think of, but probably the most fundamental, I'm going to say the most fundamental thing that people should think about is, I would love people to consider looking at their redox status, and what supplementation in that arena could be very helpful.
did you
And
say how
is there a way to determine that redox status, or should we all just assume we need some help in there?
If you're 70 years old, you have 10% of the signals you had when you were 10. So as I say, people could try the supplement. I think that 50% of people will experience a significant change in a month, percent in 90 days. Everyone benefits. I can show you data that's just crazy. Everybody benefits. It needs to be managed.
how does the benefit show up? How does the benefit show up, Dr. Bruce?
The first benefit that most people experience is sleep improvement, but people's moods are often sort of modulated. Next, people will see sugar and cholesterol benefits, but it will change the epigenetics in as many as 3,000 genes. I spoke to a guy recently who was doing biological age measures on folks who had used this supplement. At 3 months in, they were getting a 4-year age benefit.
Wow, tremendous.
Big deal.
So you can reach out to Dr. Bruce for this supplement.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Dr. Feldman. It's great to have you on the program again. And, aging, it's not random, right? It follows patterns, energy system, inflammation signaling, nervous system regulation, your reserve capacity changes over time. In part one, we really reframed longevity as capacity, vitality, enjoyment. And in part two, now you've shown us the biology underneath really is what is making the shifts happen and those systems and how they appear. So I'm looking forward to our third episode with you, the Longevity That Works series. We'll look at the biology and we'll look at the practical daily actions that can influence how you age. So we're going to talk about, including movement, strength training, sleep quality, which we discussed a little bit today, stress management, nutrition, and recovery. So subscribe to the Wellness Wave YouTube channel so you can continue the series with us. And until next time, everyone, stay curious, stay empowered, and remember, wellness, it's in you.